The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sprawling mansion perched on a hill. Inside, the air buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the faint hum of expensive perfumes wafting through the grand ballroom. It was one of those parties where everyone seemed to have an unspoken competition: whose watch was more expensive, whose car was faster, or whose life looked more perfect on social media. The guests moved in circles, their designer outfits shimmering under crystal chandeliers. Among them, weaving silently between the clusters of people, was a young woman who didn't quite fit in. She wore a plain black dress, her hair tied back neatly, and carried a tray of champagne flutes with practiced ease. Her name wasn't important to the crowd, she was just the help. To them, she blended into the background, like furniture. They barely noticed unless it was time for another drink. But if anyone had taken a closer look, they might have seen something different. There was a calmness about her, a quiet confidence that didn't match her surroundings. While the others laughed loudly or gestured dramatically, she moved with purpose, her eyes soft but observant. She noticed things: the way one guest rolled, their eyes when someone mentioned politics, how another adjusted their cufflinks nervously before making small talk. She listened without interrupting, absorbing fragments of conversations without judgment. Still, not everyone saw her that way. A group near the bar began whispering as she passed by. One man smirked, raising his voice slightly so she could hear. "Look at her," he said, gesturing vaguely in her direction. "What do you think she does when she's not serving drinks? Probably watches TV all day." His friends chuckled, nodding along. Another chimed in. "Yeah, can you imagine her doing anything else? Like, I don't even know what kind of hobbies people like her have." She heard every word, of course. How could she not? But instead of reacting, she simply smiled politely and offered them fresh glasses of wine. Her expression gave nothing away. If anything, it almost seemed like she found their comments amusing, though no one could say for sure. What they didn't realize was that beneath that calm exterior lay a world far richer than anything they could comprehend. You see, this young woman wasn't just working to pay the bills. Music lived inside her. It always had. Growing up, she'd spent hours teaching herself songs on old out-of-tune pianos in community centers. She played whenever she could, pouring her heart into each note, even if no one was listening. It was her escape, her secret joy. And tonight, as she navigated the glittering chaos of this party, part of her wondered what these people would think, if they knew. Would they still laugh? Or would they finally see her for who she really was? Little did they know, their mocking remarks were about to take an unexpected turn. Something was about to happen that would change everything, for her and for them. As the night wore on, the party grew louder and more chaotic. The guests were well into their third or fourth drinks, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings of the ballroom. Conversations became a mix of boastful stories and playful jabs, each person trying to outshine the other. In the middle of it all, the young woman continued her rounds, refilling glasses and collecting empty trays. She moved with quiet efficiency, almost like she was invisible. But invisibility has its limits. At one point, a man with slicked back hair and an expensive watch stumbled toward the center of the room, his glass sloshily waving in the air. "Hey, hey!" he called out, his voice slurred but loud enough to draw attention. "Does anyone here actually know how to play that fancy piano over there?" He pointed dramatically at the grand piano sitting untouched in the corner, its polished surface gleaming under the soft lights. The comment sparked a round of chuckles. Someone joked about hiring a professional musician next time, while another guest sarcastically suggested they just press random keys and call it modern art. Then, as if struck by a sudden idea, a woman in a sequined dress turned her gaze toward the waitress. With a smirk, she said, "Why don't we let her try? After all, isn't that what waitresses do when they're not serving drinks? Play instruments for fun?" The room erupted in laughter. Some laughed because they thought it was funny. Others joined in because everyone else was doing it. A few glanced at the young woman, expecting her to blush or stammer or maybe even walk away. But instead, she stood still, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like time froze. The clinking of glasses and murmurs faded into the background, leaving only the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on her. "Well?" the man who'd started the whole thing urged, raising his eyebrows. "Come on, don't be shy. Show us what you've got." It wasn't clear why she decided to step forward. Maybe it was the challenge in his tone, or perhaps it was the flicker of curiosity she saw in some of the guests' faces. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper, a desire to prove to herself that she could rise above their dismissive remarks. Whatever the reason, she placed the tray gently on a nearby table and walked toward the piano. The crowd watched, some amused, others skeptical. One older gentleman leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if daring her to embarrass herself. A younger couple exchanged smirks, clearly expecting nothing more than a clumsy attempt at playing chopsticks. Even the woman in the sequined dress looked mildly intrigued, though her lips still curled into a faint smirk. When she reached the piano, she paused for a moment, running her fingers lightly over the keys. They felt cool and smooth beneath her touch, familiar yet exhilarating. Taking a deep breath, she sat down on the bench, adjusting her posture ever so slightly. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No one spoke, no one moved. All eyes were on her now, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, with a single motion, her hands descended onto the keys. The first note rang out, rich and clear, cutting through the tension like a knife. It was followed by another, and then another, until the melody began to take shape. What started as curiosity quickly turned to astonishment. The notes flowed effortlessly, weaving together into a piece that was both haunting and beautiful. It was music that demanded attention, music that couldn't be ignored. No one had seen it coming, not the guests, not even the young woman herself. But as the sound filled the room, it became clear that this was no ordinary performance. This was something extraordinary, something unforgettable. And the people who had mocked her moments ago, they were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The moment her fingers touched the keys, something shifted in the room. The first note hung in the air, crisp and pure, like a single drop of rain falling into perfect stillness. Then came another and another, until the notes began to weave together into a melody that seemed almost alive. It wasn't just music, it was emotion poured into sound, raw and unfiltered. The kind of music that makes you stop what you're doing and listen, whether you want to or not. At first, the guests didn't know how to react. Some exchanged puzzled glances, as if waiting for the joke to reveal itself. Others leaned forward, slightly, their expressions softening with curiosity. But within seconds, it became clear this wasn't some amateur fumbling around on the piano. This was skill, real, undeniable talent. The young woman's hands moved with confidence, her fingers dancing across the keys like they belonged there. She played without hesitation, each note flowing seamlessly into the next. As the piece unfolded, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The earlier laughter and chatter faded completely, replaced by an almost reverent silence. Even the staff paused mid-task, peeking from behind trays and doors to catch a glimpse of what was happening. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. It was as though the entire party had been put on hold, frozen in time while she commanded the space with her music. Her choice of song was striking, a classical piece most people in the room likely hadn't heard before. It started slow and delicate, like a whisper, but soon built into something powerful and sweeping. There were moments when the melody soared, filling every corner of the grand ballroom, and others where it dipped into quiet, introspective passages that tugged at the heartstrings. It was impossible not to feel something listening to it. One guest, a middle-aged man who'd been loudly boasting about his latest business deal earlier, found himself gripping the armrest of his chair. His jaw was slightly open, his eyes fixed on the pianist. Beside him, A woman who'd spent the night snapping selfies lowered her phone, forgotten in her hand. Near the bar, a younger couple held hands unconsciously, their earlier flirtatious banter replaced by wide-eyed wonder. Even the man who drunkenly suggested she play looked stunned, his glass dangling loosely in his fingers. What made it even more remarkable was the way she played, not flashy or overdone, but with a quiet intensity that drew everyone in. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm, her focus absolute. It was as if she'd stepped into her own world, leaving the rest of them behind. And yet, somehow, her music reached out and pulled them in, making them part of the experience too. By the time the final note rang out, the room was utterly silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, the spell broke. A man in the front row exhaled sharply, as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Someone else murmured, "Wow," so softly it was barely audible. And then, almost instinctively, the applause began. At first, it was hesitant, a few scattered claps, but it quickly grew louder, filling the room with waves of sound. People rose to their feet, some cheering, others simply staring in awe. The same individuals who had mocked her earlier now couldn't take their eyes off her. One woman wiped at her cheeks, realizing only then that tears had welled up during the performance. Another man turned to his companion and said, "I can't believe we doubted her. Did you see that? Did you hear that?" But the young woman remained calm, unfazed by the sudden burst of admiration. She sat quietly for a moment, letting the last echoes of the music fade away. Then, with a small, polite smile, she stood up and gave a slight bow. Her expression never changed. It was neither triumphant nor humble, just steady and composed, as if she'd always known she could do this, even when no one else did. And maybe that was the most powerful thing of all. While the guests struggled to process what they'd just witnessed, she simply walked back to her tray, picked it up, and resumed her duties, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Except now, every eye in the room followed her movements, filled with a newfound respect, and perhaps a touch of guilt. The applause lingered in the air, fading slowly like the last notes of her performance. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of excitement and disbelief that no one seemed ready to let go of just yet. People were still on their feet, clapping, some even whistling now. But amidst all the noise, the young woman remained calm, almost as if she'd stepped out of the spotlight entirely. She didn't linger by the piano or soak up the attention. Instead, she quietly returned to her tray of drinks, resuming her role as if nothing unusual had happened. But the guests weren't done with her, not by a long shot. One by one, they began approaching her, curiosity overtaking their earlier mockery. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit was the first to reach her. He cleared his throat awkwardly, as though unsure how to start. "That was incredible," he said finally, his voice tinged with both awe and embarrassment. "I mean, I don't think I've ever heard anything like that. Where did you learn to play like that?" She glanced at him briefly, her expression polite but distant. "I taught myself," she replied simply, her tone measured and calm. Her answer left him speechless for a moment, before he stammered out another question about whether she composed her own music. Again, she responded briefly, neither encouraging nor discouraging further conversation. Others followed suit, forming a small crowd around her. A woman holding a glass of wine gushed, "You have to perform professionally. Seriously, do you have any idea how talented you are?" Another guest chimed in, "Are you on social media? You should be. You'd blow up overnight." Their words came fast and eager, each trying to outdo the other in offering praise or advice. Some suggested venues where she could perform, while others asked if she'd ever considered entering competitions. It was as if they couldn't get enough of her now, desperate to make up for their earlier dismissive remarks. Despite the flood of attention, she stayed grounded, nodding politely, but keeping her responses short. She didn't seem interested in basking in their admiration or using the moment to prove a point. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, letting her actions speak louder than any words could. There was something magnetic about her composure, a blend of grace and strength that made it impossible to look away. As the initial wave of excitement began to settle, the young woman found herself alone for a brief moment, standing near a quiet corner of the room. She set down her tray and took a deep breath, allowing herself a rare pause. Her mind wandered back to the journey that had brought her here, the countless hours spent practicing on old, broken pianos, the sacrifices she'd made to keep her passion alive, and the days when she wondered if anyone would ever truly hear her music. For a fleeting second, she felt a pang of satisfaction, not because she'd proven those people wrong, but because she'd reminded herself of what truly mattered. Their applause wasn't validation. It was just a reminder that talent has a way of cutting through prejudice and assumptions. Still, she knew better than to let the moment define her. Fame and recognition weren't why she played. She did it because it was part of who she was, woven into the fabric of her being. Her thoughts were interrupted when an older woman approached her. Her demeanor calm and thoughtful. Unlike the others, she didn't bombard the waitress with questions or compliments. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for sharing your gift with us tonight. That was beautiful." Her words were sincere, spoken without any hint of condescension or ulterior motive. For the first time since the performance, the young woman smiled genuinely, a flicker of warmth crossing her face. "You're welcome," she replied softly, meeting the woman's gaze. In that brief exchange, there was an unspoken understanding, a connection that transcended the superficiality of the evening. It was a reminder that not everyone saw her as the help anymore. To some, she was already so much more. As the night wore on, the party resumed its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere felt different now. The laughter and chatter returned, but there was a new layer of respect in the air. And while the young woman continued her work, moving silently between the guests, she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in how people looked at her. The mocking glances were gone, replaced by something deeper, admiration perhaps, or maybe even a little guilt. But none of that mattered to her. What mattered was the music, and as long as she had that, she knew she'd always find her place in the world. As the party began to wind down, the energy in the room shifted once again. The guests, still buzzing from the unexpected performance, started to drift toward the exits or gather in smaller groups to discuss what they'd just witnessed. Conversations revolved around one topic, the young woman who had stunned them all. With her music, some spoke animatedly, replaying moments from her performance, while others reflected quietly, their earlier arrogance replaced by a mix of admiration and introspection. In a quiet corner of the ballroom, the older woman who had thanked the pianist earlier stood deep in thought. She was known for her sharp eye when it came to spotting talent. Having spent years supporting artists and musicians through various philanthropic efforts, there was something about this young woman that resonated deeply with her. Not just her skill at the piano, but the quiet strength she carried. It wasn't flashy or self-promoting. It was authentic, the kind of authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. Making up her mind, the older woman approached the waitress once more. This time, she didn't stop with a simple compliment. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady and warm. The young woman turned to face her, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Do you have plans for your music? I mean, beyond tonight?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment she hesitated, unsure how to respond. Her dreams had always been tucked away safely in the back of her mind, too precious to share with anyone, especially strangers. But there was something sincere about the way the older woman asked, as if she genuinely wanted to understand rather than pry. After a pause, she shook her head slightly. "Not really," she admitted. "Music is personal for me. It's my own space." The older woman nodded, clearly moved by the honesty of the answer. "I get that," she said softly. "But sometimes, personal things deserve to be shared with the world. Talent like yours shouldn't stay hidden." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, handing it over gently. "If you ever change your mind, give me a call. I run a program for artists who need support to take their work further. You wouldn't have to do it alone." For the first time that evening, the young woman looked truly surprised. She stared at the card in her hand, its simplicity belying the weight of the offer it represented. A part of her wanted to dismiss it immediately. After all, she'd managed, fine on her own for so long, but another part felt a spark of possibility ignite within her. Could she step out of the shadows and into the spotlight? More importantly, did she want to? Her hesitation must have shown because the older woman smiled reassuringly. "Think about it," she said. "There's no pressure. Just know that opportunities like this don't come often, and people like you inspire others. Your story could mean something to someone else someday." With that, the older woman gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The noise of the party seemed distant now, muffled by the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. On one hand, she felt grateful for the kindness and belief being extended to her. On the other, she couldn't shake the fear of stepping into unfamiliar territory, of losing control over something that had always been hers and hers alone. As she tucked the card into her pocket, her fingers brushed against the fabric thoughtfully. Maybe it was worth considering, just a little, not for fame or recognition, but because deep down, she knew her music had the power to touch lives. And if sharing it meant helping even one person feel less alone, wasn't that worth taking a risk? By the time the last guest left the mansion and the staff began cleaning up, the young woman found herself lingering near the grand piano. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, remembering the rush of playing earlier. For the first time, she allowed herself to dream. Not big, not wildly, but enough to imagine a future where her music might reach beyond these walls. It was scary, yes, but also exhilarating. As she finally stepped away and headed home, the card safely tucked in her pocket, she realized something important. Maybe she didn't have to figure everything out right away. Sometimes, all it took was a single step forward, and tonight, she'd already taken that step without even realizing it. The days that followed the party felt like a blur for the young woman. Life went on as usual. Early mornings, long shifts, at work, and quiet evenings spent alone. But there was something different now, a subtle shift in her routine. Every time she passed by a piano or heard music playing in the background, she found herself thinking about the older woman's offer. The business card still sat tucked away in her pocket, its edges slightly worn from being touched so often. She hadn't called yet, but the idea lingered in her mind like an unspoken promise. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, she decided to sit down at the small keyboard she kept in her tiny apartment. It wasn't much, an old electronic, model with sticky keys, but it had been her companion through countless nights of practice. As her fingers glided over the keys, she let herself get lost in the melody, just as she always did. But this time, something felt different. Instead of playing only for herself, she imagined someone else listening, a stranger, maybe even a crowd. The thought made her pause, mid-note, her hands hovering above the keys. What would it be like, she wondered, to share her music with people who truly appreciated it? Not because they were impressed by some flashy performance at a fancy party, but because they connected with the emotions behind the notes. For years, she'd played to fill the silence in her own life, to escape the weight of her struggles. But what if her music could do more than that? What if it could touch others too? The next morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the business card. Her heart raced as the line rang, each second stretching longer than the last. When the older woman answered, her voice warm and welcoming, the young woman almost hung up. But then she took a deep breath and introduced herself, explaining that she'd thought about the offer and wanted to learn more. They met later that week at a cozy cafe downtown. Over cups of coffee, the older woman explained how her program worked, a mix of mentorship, performance opportunities, and resources to help undiscovered artists grow. It's not about turning you into someone you're not, she emphasized. It's about giving you the tools to shine in your own way. The young woman listened intently, asking questions and sharing bits of her journey. By the end of the conversation, she felt a spark of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Over the following months, her life began to change in ways she never expected. With guidance from the program, she started performing at smaller venues, local galleries, community centers, and intimate gatherings. At first, she was nervous, unsure how audiences would respond, but every time she sat down at the piano, the nerves melted away, replaced by the familiar comfort of the music. And to her surprise, people didn't just listen, they connected. After shows, strangers approached her to share how her pieces had moved them, how they'd found solace or joy in her melodies. Slowly but surely, word spread. Her performances grew bigger, drawing larger crowds and earning rave reviews online. Critics praised her unique style and emotional depth, calling her a hidden gem finally stepping into the light. Yet despite the growing attention, she remained grounded. Fame wasn't what drove her. It was the knowledge that her music mattered to people, that it gave them something to hold on to when life felt heavy. Through it all, the older woman stayed by her side, offering advice and encouragement whenever needed. They developed a bond that went beyond mentor and mentee. It became a friendship built on mutual respect and shared passion. One day, as they sat together after a successful concert, the older woman smiled knowingly. "You see," she said, "this is exactly why I reached out to you. Talent like yours doesn't belong in the shadows." The young woman looked out at the crowd mingling near the stage, their faces glowing with appreciation. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for everyone who needed to hear her story, and in doing so, she had found her place in the world. Months turned into a year, and the young woman's life transformed in ways she could have never imagined. What started as small performances at local venues soon grew into sold-out concerts at prestigious halls. Her music resonated with people from all walks of life: students, parents, seniors, even skeptics who didn't think much of modern performers. Each note she played carried fragments of her journey: the quiet nights spent practicing alone, the mocking comments that once stung but ultimately fueled her determination, and the countless hours she poured into perfecting her craft. One evening, standing backstage at a grand concert hall, she took a moment to soak it all in. The room buzzed with anticipation, filled with hundreds of people eagerly waiting for the show to begin. Among them were familiar faces, some who had doubted her, others who had supported her along the way. She recognized a few guests from that fateful party, their expressions now soft with admiration rather than mockery. There was no bitterness in her heart toward them. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of gratitude. Their earlier dismissal had pushed her to prove something, not to them, but to herself. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the applause was thunderous. Spotlights illuminated her as she walked to the piano, her steps steady and confident. For a brief moment, she paused to take in the sight of the crowd, letting the weight of how far she'd come settle over her. Then, with a deep breath, she sat down and placed her hands on the keys. As the first note rang out, the audience fell silent, captivated once again by the magic of her music. Her performance that night wasn't just technically brilliant, it was deeply personal. Between pieces, she spoke to the audience, sharing snippets of her story. "I used to think my music belonged only to me," she said softly, her voice carrying through the hall. "But I've learned that art is meant to be shared. It connects us when words fail, reminds us we're not alone." Her words struck a chord, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. By the end of the concert, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Afterward, during the meet and greet session, fans lined up to thank her. Some brought flowers, others handwritten notes expressing how her music had touched their lives. One older man, his eyes glistening with tears, told her, "Your songs helped me heal after losing my wife. Thank you for giving me hope again." Another young girl shyly handed her a drawing of a piano, saying, "You inspired me to start learning. Maybe one day I'll play like you." These moments stayed with her long after the event ended. They reminded her why she did what she did, not for fame or applause, but because her music mattered. It had become a bridge between her and the world, a way to remind people they weren't alone in their struggles. Backstage, as she packed up her things, she spotted the older woman who had believed in her from the beginning. Their eyes met, and they shared a knowing smile. No words were needed. Everything had already been said. That night, driving home under a starlit sky, she reflected on how far she'd come. From being dismissed as just the help to becoming someone whose music moved hearts across cities, she had proven that true talent cannot and will not stay hidden forever. The journey hadn't been easy, but every challenge had shaped her into the person she was today. And while she knew success wasn't permanent, she also knew this. As long as she stayed true to herself and her music, she would always find her place in the world. Because sometimes, all it takes is believing in your own light, even when the world refuses to see it, to shine brighter than anyone ever expected.